And then for the last 2 years that I've been here, both the last conference and this one, I'm now in a cozy small studio of about 950 people that work in games, that work in television animation, that work in live action feature films, and moving on to direct to DVD and so on. And we are part of a much larger, we are a very, very small part of a much larger family or a company called Technicolor that really is an audiovisual arts and sciences company. There's so much more that we can learn, if you like, from the larger ecosystem. And I think it's those kind of insights that we can share with each other and bring to each other at times like this. So the ideas, I think, are what comes from this conference, and put together with things that you do, they become the things that I think creates the India innovation for this industry. Why do some companies succeed while others don't move up the tiers from 3 to 2 to 1? How do some people achieve delivery using, let's say, 0.5x of what the next guy does? We've seen many examples of clients bringing their shows to India and other parts of the world and giving one episode to one studio and the next episode to another studio. And it's really interesting to see how these two different studios, using different processes, can actually deliver the same product, arguably of the same quality, but with a completely different set of resources, both human as well as technical. How do we move up the value chain in terms of, how can you avoid, when you take a major project from a big world leader, how do you avoid being arbitrary? How do you avoid being experimental? And I think that we've said this from the get-go, that it's a given that we'll have the most creative people with us, but like every other industry, and you'll hear that from some of the big speakers today, including from our keynote, that there is a method to the perceived madness of this industry.
It's recording.
So besides the processes, and besides starting an animation and gaming studio, which in my mind is really like getting onto a roller coaster that you haven't been on before, I think it's really important to understand that besides the understanding of the processes, and besides the upward constant escalation of learning new tools and new technologies, but it's also really important about understanding the thought patterns that people have. And clients' expectations change, teams' expectations change, methods of working changes, consumer behavior changes, and we'll see that as we go through the vast deck of what are the different sectors that we work through under this one very enabling umbrella. I'm just going to leave that as a thought for you, because each of you have your own secret sauce for how you can motivate your teams and how you can galvanize your little business model into a business. Which actually brings me to the important next slide. And that is the business models. If you go back to the NASSCOM report from 2009, and I think we will do one in the next year or two, you'll see that basically we talked of, for example, the integrated studio model, where there were Indian producers or foreign producers. We talked of, in that report, the fact that there were the standalone business models, where people were either pure service providers or co-production companies, or people that were beginning journeys to create original content for themselves, which is the content creation model. And I think that what I'm going to talk about a little bit later, just to finish this and provoke everyone's thought, is that there is another big thing that's happening on the business model front, and I'll come back to that. So, at the end of the day, I think while we are doing all the stuff that you saw on these last 2 or 3 slides for 364 days of the year, for these 1 or 2 days, I think this is a great place for us to trade on ideas. And hopefully, if you take away 1 or 2 big ideas from this conference, that's what we come back for year after year after year. We've spoken a lot about the best practices in previous conferences. We've talked of what the ISO kind of thing expects from the quality paradigm. We've talked of what makes big studios happen. We've talked about scaling. We've talked about the service model versus the original IP model. And I think all of those have been imbibed, but one of the things that we're beginning to see is that more light bulbs are flashing brightly. And what do I mean by that? If we went back to the same report from 2 years ago, we saw that, for example, on the animation side, there were about 150, 200 companies that were tier 3 and had a top line of, let's say, sub $1 million US. And then there were about 30 to 50 companies that were in the $1 to $5 million, and then there were about 10 odd companies that were above that level. And the good news really is that I think we're almost beginning to see the advent of a super tier, where you are now seeing companies that might be one handful and hopefully growing further, where that super tier has companies that do 3 or 4 times their top line that was the benchmark of 2 or 3 years ago. So I started by saying that one of the visions that we have is to make sure that we do a dipstick on a year-by-year basis and figure out where the metrics are going. And it's very, very encouraging to see that while at the small, more boutique level, there are a lot more people coming into the room, and the show of hands indicated that. But on the other hand, you're also seeing really big companies building the super tier, which can be very, very provocative from the point of view of a positive momentum for the business in this country. I've asked our clients, I've asked co-producers, I've asked my fellow colleagues from the industry as to what makes us a country that is growing as significantly as we are in terms of animation, gaming, and visual effects. And Rajiv referred to this in his comment earlier, that people may have come here for price, but they stayed here for quality. I actually want to take this thought beyond. I am convinced, I am absolutely convinced that people stay here and companies grow for one reason only, and that is what I would call seamlessness. Quality is a given. The price is already negotiated. Projects take 6 months to 2.5 years to execute, depending on if you're doing, for example, like we are, the 2nd or the 3rd season of a TV series. It's the fact that our clients can sleep at night. It's the fact that we can sleep at night. It's the fact that our interaction is the most hassle-free. It's the seamlessness. It's the reason why swimmers take great care in picking the kind of bathing suits they wear, because they want to have that extra point-something seconds when they're cutting through the water. It's the seamlessness that defines excellence when it comes to doing multi-local production. And I want to leave that thought with you as the defining thought of how do we become more seamless in our delivery and moving up the value chain. Zooming out from there, I think one of the things that I'll say to many of you who raise your hands who are new is that many people come into animation, visual effects, and gaming wanting to be in that industry. But the ones that I think have succeeded over the last 5 or 10 years are people who looked at the larger ecosystem. You cannot really have an understanding of the animation business and what you need to achieve in that unless you understand right from where it starts in the process of creating that animation to the mindset of the consumer that is actually going to be deciding if it's a hit show or not. And I think really I'm just putting out for you the 4 kind of buckets around which we need to wrap our thoughts, no matter which part of the business we are in. And in no particular order, if I started on the left-hand top corner, because that's most of the people that we see in this conference from time to time. It's the production studios, it's hardware and software providers, people who bring the technology to us, servers and data centers and everyone else, and chips and bits and bytes and of all kinds. And very significantly, it's also players in training and education, because the fountain of talent that we require moving forward is really the springboard that's the springboard from where they come. So that's kind of the people that usually are, if you like, the key stakeholders for the NAG4 forum. What is their bedrock? They are supported by the people on the left bottom quadrant, which is, of course, the artists and the professionals themselves. I think animator is too restrictive a word, because they are riggers and they are modelers and they are texturers and they are compositors and so on and so forth. And people that have several different skill sets that make up the animation or the visual effects or the gaming production value chain. And significantly, we're seeing the growth of a very large CG or a digital community. I'd like to argue that maybe one of the reasons that India has catapulted as far ahead as it has in the last few years is really the birth and the growth of that community. When we came very late into, for example, the traditional animation game, we were definitely outside of the 5 or 7 countries that had developed a 20-year head start on us in terms of traditional animation. But I think the moment it went digital, and all of us know that there is something inexplicable about the magic that happens when an Indian sits behind a computer. I think that's really what kind of was the tipping point that created this huge inflection for the growth of digital animation out of India across all the fields that we talk about. On the right-hand top corner, I think, is something that we know little about, and those are who are the people that would like to invest in this. I've always said across any business in India that for a good business proposition, there is never a dearth of capital. While other countries have been, chasing government grants and chasing investors of all kinds and creating funds and so on and so forth, a lot of the work that goes on in the creative industries in India, be it broadcast, be it production for television, be it new media, of course it's funded by some venture funding and some private equity and so on, but there is never a dearth of capital for a good business that has assured or a perceived assured return. So investors in other parts of the world, a lot of the content that gets created is funded by brands and by advertising. And that hasn't happened here yet. For example, sports icons. Sports is a huge category that is now just emerging. We are a sports loving country, but we actually don't take that all the way into licensing and merchandising and branding and so on. So there's a whole category that's coming out. The licensing and merchandising field, we've had a few people that spoke on at NAGFO forums in the last couple of years. We had a few panels on that. It's emerging. It's a fraction of the world market, it's a fraction of the local market, but it's going to grow big time. And everyone that is from the world majors, that are either broadcasters for kids or creating content for kids, cannot ignore the fact that if the core is to create a product, which is some of the products you see on the screen, then really what's the jam and the cream is to be able to monetize it across what we loosely call ancillaries, which are actually merchandising and licensing and so on and so forth. And so that's the bunch on the right hand side, and we're going to see presentations from some really big companies today, DQ from Hyderabad and others who have really done a lot of work on the co-production front. And those co-production discussions started here 8, 9, 10 years ago and have really mushroomed into a very, very large story. Last but not the least, on the bottom right is the pipe or the method by which all this gets carried to the consumer. And that's where we really have this debate of why don't we see more Indian content? Why aren't we creating more of our IP? The answer lies in that bottom right corner. The more broadcasters penetrate, have more subscription, have more advertising, have more reach, the more channels will come in, the more they'll be able to buy. Publishers, less than 7% of India's retail trade is organized. It's expected to be as high as 25% in about 3 years' time. There are malls coming up, there are the big guys like the Tatas and the Birlas and everyone else getting into creating the retail chains. And as retailing improves, obviously the method for us to sell books and games and comics and everything else becomes exponentially higher. And finally, of course, are the distributors. So it's more mature when it comes to, for example, distribution for movie content. It's less mature when it comes to distribution for television content. It's emerging when it comes to distribution for games content and so on and so forth. So if you want to know the magic answer, if you want to measure how this industry will grow, you yourself can keep an eye on that bottom right quadrant, and you will know when the time is right to produce something that can be sold in a manner that you can get your money back. This next slide is really a directional slide. Don't take it as an accurate slide. I think what we're going to do over the next year, I'm going to engage all of you, is to figure out how the animation industry will mature, how the gaming industry will mature, how the VFX industry will mature. And I've used a very simple red, yellow and green story here. And it's very indicative and it's very personal with a few people that just sat around to make this slide. So you look at, for example, what we talked of on the previous slide. What's the story for broadcasters? What's the story for producers? What's the story for technology? What's the story for training? And if we look at the left-hand axis, what's our reach and customer base that exists? So you'll see that for distributors it's a red, because they really, for example, in television, they don't have a great customer base to sell animated content today. But for broadcasters and producers, of course, the market is huge. And for technology, mainly because they need to sell more licensed and paid technology, that's a yellow. So the market is a definite green